Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about how we traverse the DOM or the structure of HTML and using JavaScript, either add, manipulate, alter a page while it's running. When we're talking about the DOM is the ability to, within a page and an HTML tag, tell it that we need to go either to children of the tag, siblings of the tag, parents, or some of the other traversals to go through. Because remember, we have to be able to point to the correct position within our HTML tags to be able to alter them. I've posted this as a file and also given some links to a more extensive list of traversal. So let's take a look at one. Here we have a simple form with some asterisks inside a place that, based upon what's typed in, once I click on the button, I add a section based upon a position. Now, normally within our positions that we're looking for, what makes it most unique are things like IDs, because IDs can only be used in one place. So this shows up whenever I haven't added a correct position or information. Let's look at code. Now, I've given you this file. It's the email list file. And what I'm bringing up is the index.html and email list.js. Now, the part I'm interested in is the form. Notice that it has an ID, so I can access and reposition to the form tag by finding the ID where email is form. I could then traverse by going to any children within the form. Anything that is before my form closes is considered a child. Now, once I get to a child, I can tell it to get to the next tag after the label is closed by saying next sibling, because input is the next sibling of label because it is a child of form. I could also say go to the previous sibling to go back up to label. So now here's how I can add comments or any information to this form. Now again, remember, I have to be able to reposition based upon a unique identifier. Inside my form for my first email input, I look for ID is equal to email underscore address 1 underscore error. That positions me on the span. From there, if I want to add anything before the span closes, that will show up to the user instead of the asterisk. Well, then I have to work with a child node of span. So again, I can tell it a child node and then use any of the attributes like value, and I can alter the asterisk since it is a child of span. I can do the same thing for any placement to where I have a unique identifier that I can reposition to. So let's look at our JS to see how we did this. Now, in order to position myself, I've created a function that will take any ID and it's going to return the element by ID. But now I have to make sure the ID is what goes between the quotes here. It'll put it in the $, and that way I can pass any ID to this function and get positioned back. Okay? Now, we want this to load when our window loads. So when our window.unload, I'm going to execute this anonymous function to where I tell it, go find and load my function with the $sign, passing it this particular ID list when the user clicks on it. So I'm going to go get this information, load it. So based upon a user interaction of onClick, it takes join list, goes up to the function I showed you before for the ID, and loads it. Now after that, again, I'm going to reposition where the ID says email list 1 whenever the focus is there. So I can reposition to that placement. So this automatically is sitting there and running and running and running until the user accesses the onClick, because it's going to set the focus at the beginning when I load it. Okay, let's go back to the index.html. Now, again, that is just sitting there and waiting and waiting and waiting for me to click on my button. Here's the join list. So the minute I click on that join list, which again is here, I'm going to go call my join list and execute the function for this join list. Now, first of all, again, I tell it I need to go to where the ID is address 1, and I want the value that's typed in, and I want to load it into email address 1. I then, again, call this function where the email address 2 is the ID, and I send it back and get the value of it and load it here. So I am setting either currently my isValid is true. I'm going to use this to determine if I need to add anything or take away from my errors. Once we get these down, it gets pretty repetitious. So I check my first email address the user's entered. If it's null, then I need to reposition myself to where the ID is equal to email address 1 error by calling the function, returning the element by the ID, and the first child node value is now set to the field as required. And it's no longer valid, so I set it to false. So actually what this is doing is it's going to my HTML and finding this ID. That's where I'm placed, so I have the span tag. I want to add a first child, and I want to set the value. So instead of the asterisk, I now have a child node that says whatever I want my error to say. Else, I set it to nothing so I can take away an error that's there. I do this to every other part of the form that I'm error checking. So it is repetition at this point. Another error I'm checking is if email address 1 is not the same as email address 2. So if it's not equal to. Again, I'm always adding a first child to the span, setting the node value to some information. When I get done with that, if my is valid, if I haven't had to set it to false, then I want to reposition to where the ID is a form, grab that tag, and submit it. That's my action, because my form has no action right now. If I go to here and I look at my form, my action is bringing up another HTML file, but it's not attached to this input button. So I have to submit it because I have no submit button. but it will run the action if I actually do the submit. I hope this is clear. Watch it again if you have problems, or email me if you do not understand it. Thank you. Go on to the next one, or go to the Udacity to watch their tutorials.